India, a land of seductive riches. Land of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. A priceless gem, which, legend says, was given by the god Krishna to test mankind's greed. Possessed of such wealth and beauty, thought Krishna, would men behave like beasts? Or would they think and achieve wisdom? This is the story of India and its conquerors. One stormed south across the mountains. One came from across the seas. Both were hungry for wealth and dominion. Each would become his own answer to Krishna's question. Wise man or beast? For 300 years, the Mughal Empire dominated India. It was a Mughal emperor who created the radiant mountain of white marble called the Taj Mahal, one of the wonders of the world. The wealth and sophistication of the Mughal court were legendary. Here, Mughal kings ruled from the famous peacock throne made of gold, rubies, and sapphires. All these treasures of the Mughal Empire were the legacy of one remarkable man, a poet, a killer, a wild nomad who was not from India at all. His name was Babur. Babur's life began in 1483 in Fergana, a small kingdom in the highlands of Central Asia. Fergana was one square of a blood-stained checkerboard of competing dynasties, each struggling to expand its little empire. But a little empire wasn't what Babur had in mind. Babur's dynasty was part Turk and part Mongol. Mughals, as the Persians called them. Babur was a direct descendant of the two greatest conquerors of Central Asian history, Genghis Khan and Timur, or Tamerlane. He wanted something that would be worthy of their memory.
From the very beginning, Babur tried to take inspiration from Genghis and Timur. These were his two heroes. And it was probably this reason which had at times goaded him to think of India as his final destination.
Born to nobility, at 11, Babur inherited Fergana. Almost immediately, other warlords tried to take it away from him. Not surprisingly for one so young, the fortunes of war started to turn against him. Before long, he had lost much of his kingdom, and his men deserted in droves to hitch their fortunes to more promising leaders.
All 700 or 800 of my lords and warriors deserted me. It was a terrible blow. I remember I couldn't help crying.
He was only 15. It was a harsh education which made young Babur's heart ache. but his early failures toughened him.
If you desire to rule and conquer, you don't just fold your hands when things go wrong. You act.
Action meant war. And with whichever followers he could muster, he started to wage guerrilla warfare against his more powerful neighbors. He and his men seesawed between victory and defeat. Allies deserted him, enemies became allies. One day in 1501, he laughed when he realized a sword he had given to an ally as a token of loyalty one year was the same one that almost split his skull in battle the next.
My own soul is my most faithful friend. My own heart, my truest confidant.
Always, Babur's ambition was to found a great dynasty like his ancestors. He needed children who would be his heirs. He admitted he was so shy as a young man, his mother and sisters had to bully him into sleeping with his first wife. But before long, he had more wives and a son, Humayun, on whom the weight of Babur's dreams would fall. With his succession assured, the question that now dogged him was, what would he leave his sons? He had lost his kingdom and was being shut out of Central Asia. So where was the land in which his dynasty could flourish? Slowly, Babur's reputation as a warlord was growing, and with it the perception that he might be a future ruler after all. Lured by the promise of conquest and booty, warriors of other dynasties began to join him. In 1504, Babur's fortunes took a decisive turn for the better. He caught wind of tumult in the Afghan kingdom of Kabul to the south. Here, he thought, was a chance. At the age of 21, Babur rode out of the mountains with his small band of men and raced towards Kabul. Warriors joined him as he approached, and they swept into the city. The battle for Kabul was short, and Babur triumphed. As he settled into his new home, Babur immediately fell in love with Afghanistan. Its cool climate, and the beautiful rivers of its fresh upland plateaus. Kabul signified a new beginning, an end to the years of wandering. But not, of course, an end to his dreams of empire. Not far to the south lay the vast teeming land of Hindustan, India. He had heard many stories of its wealth. He realized it was now within his grasp.
From the time I took Kabul, I set my heart on Hindustan.
In 1504, the Indian subcontinent was a disunited mass of independent kingdoms and sultanates. Hindu in the south, largely Muslim in the north. One of the largest and most powerful of these was Hindustan, controlled by the Sultanate of Delhi. Babur knew he stood no chance of directly confronting the armies of Hindustan. But having taken Kabul, he lost no time in making an exploratory raid into the plains of northern India, just to see. With a small army, he moved south in 1505. He was amazed by what he found.
I had never experienced such heat or anything like Hindustan before. Different plants, different trees, different animals and birds, different tribes and people, different manners and customs. It was astonishing, truly astonishing.
India exceeded his wildest expectations. He discovered beautifully crafted textiles, refined sugar, perfumes, and spices. Here indeed was a rich land. As he headed back to Kabul, his resolve to return was redoubled. But he would have to bide his time. For 20 years, Babur made Kabul his home. 20 years in which he finally had time to taste the pleasures of life. Until now, he had been a clean-living and sober young Muslim. In Kabul, all that started to change.
At that time, I had not committed the sin of drinking to drunkenness, and did not know the delight and pleasure of being drunk as it should be known. Here, all the implements of pleasure and revelry were ready and present. If I didn't drink now, when would I?
He discovered a taste for fine wines and the sweetmeats laced with hashish called majun. In Kabul, he drank often. His memoirs filled with parties, drunkenness, and head-splitting hangovers.
We drank on the boat until late that night. We got on our horses, reeling from side to side, then let them gallop, free-reined. The next morning, they told me I had galloped into camp, holding a torch. I swear, I didn't remember a thing, except that when I got back to my tent, I was extremely sick.
In Kabul, Babur learned how to let go. But he never forgot that if he was ever to take Hindustan, his troops had to stay disciplined. He had no qualms about extreme punishments.
I had one of the soldiers clubbed at the gate for stealing a pot of oil. He died. The others were successfully cowed by this punishment.
As he explored Afghanistan, this ruthless nomad, who was perfectly capable of putting entire cities to the sword, became a keen student of flowers.
All sorts grow in these foothills. I once counted them and found 32 or 33 different kinds. We named one the rose-scented tulip because it smelt rather like a rose. It grows all by itself on the Sheikh's Plain.
Joy was to sit peacefully in one of his beautiful highland gardens and write poetry. He built no fewer than 10 gardens in Kabul. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Before long, Babur's 7 wives had produced him 18 children. He was devoted to all of them. But it was his firstborn son, Humayun, who he was determined would inherit a great kingdom. Babur bided his time, watching and waiting for his opportunity in India. Finally, in 1526, it arrived. The Sultanate of Delhi was overtaken by internal strife. Babur realized his moment had come. It would be now or never. Babur marched into northern India with 12,000 men. The Sultan of Delhi marched to meet him with 100,000 men and 1,000 armored elephants. They met on the plain of Panipat, north of Delhi. Babur's trump card was the discipline of his troops and his Turkish artillery. The Indian elephants charged, but were met with explosions of cannons and mortar. They panicked, spun, and stampeded. The whole army fell into disarray. Just a few hours after it began, the battle became a rout. The Indians, including their leader, were massacred as they ran. Babur had just pulled off an astonishing military feat. Finally, Hindustan was his. With Hindustan in his grasp, one of the first things Babur did was to send Hindustani dancing girls to entertain his wives in their harem in Kabul. It was a gracious gesture. His wives, covered and restrained, their faces painted stiffly white in the Central Asian style, must have been astonished. Out of meetings like this, of the stark world of Central Asian Islam with the lush anarchy of India, would arise the glories of the Mughal style. As Babur took stock of his new possession, even he, well versed in plunder, was stunned. The astonishing treasuries of Hindustan contained the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Its name, he learned, meant mountain of light. He was told it was worth enough to feed the entire world for 2.5 days. Offered it as a gift, Babur refused and left it with his son Humayun. Suddenly, he was less interested in the riches than in how to govern this strange new land. But as he surveyed Hindustan, his enthusiasm for it started to melt away.
There is no beauty in its people, no graceful social intercourse, no poetic talent or understanding, no etiquette, nobility, or manliness. The arts and crafts have no harmony or symmetry. There is no ice, cold water, good food, or bread in the markets. The peasantry and common people parade around stark naked. Hindustan is a place of little charm.
But Babur was determined he would build Hindustan into something worthy of his dynasty. He would introduce Mughal order and symmetry into what seemed to him a chaotic and senseless land. He made the princes of Hindustan, the Rajputs, submit to him and laid the foundations for the future empire. And it dawned on Babur that it was no longer enough to be a successful conqueror. To fulfill his dreams for his heirs, he had to become a wise ruler as well. A sacrifice to God was necessary. In an extravagant public ceremony, Babur swore off drink. He had his drinking vessels crushed and distributed the gold and silver to the poor. At the age of 43, Babur had achieved his dream of empire. He settled into Hindustan and continued work on his autobiography, the first ever written in the Muslim world.
I have simply set down what happened. I have reported every good and evil of father and brother, every fault and virtue of relative and stranger. May the reader excuse me.
And everywhere, Babur built the square, symmetrical gardens called Charbagh, which were the perfect expression of Mughal beauty. The radiance of nature, bound by the rigid geometrical order of Islam. And it was in his gardens that he reflected on his turbulent life and his successes in battles, both with enemies and himself. The temptations of alcohol had been almost overwhelming.
2 years ago, my craving for a wine party was such to bring me to the verge of tears. This year, praise God, that desire has completely left my mind.
The one thing that never left his mind was his homeland, Fergana. One day, as he ate a melon, he found himself crying as its flavor brought back memories of the fresh uplands of his childhood. He confessed to his youngest daughter that he wanted to retire and turn the reins of power over to Humayun. But in 1530, 4 years after the conquest of Hindustan, Humayun fell sick. His doctors gave him up for dead. It was a catastrophe, the death not only of a beloved son, but the heir to Babur's dynasty and empire. Babur had learned the wisdom of sacrifice. But what on earth could he offer God to persuade him to spare his son? Priests and advisors came with suggestions. He could sacrifice the Koh-i-Noor. But Babur knew it was a worthless bauble compared to the life of his son. He decided only one sacrifice could possibly compare. For days, he prayed fervently to Allah to take his own life in exchange for Humayun's. Soon after, Humayun recovered, and sure enough, Babur fell sick. He stayed true to his oath and refused all offers of treatment. He'd made a deal with Allah, a life for a life. Who was he to renege? He turned his face to the wall. Three months later, he died, aged 47. Babur had ruled India for only 4 years, but the dynasty he founded would rule it for almost 300. Akbar, Babur's grandson, would for the first time unite the subcontinent. Shah Jahan, Babur's great-great-grandson would build the Taj Mahal. The Mughals laid the foundations of the India we know today.
They were able to create a large empire within India. They were able to establish the great institutions of empire through their army, their especially important dynastic and other alliance policies with the Rajputs. It was a very creative fusion.
Over the generations, Mughal India would become synonymous with opulence, refinement, and wealth. Before long, it attracted the hungry gaze of yet other treasure seekers. This time, they would come from further west. Just over 300 years after Babur died, India was swallowed by the British Empire. By the end of the 19th century, Britain dominated most of the world, but India was its most valued possession. Queen Victoria called it the jewel in her crown. The man who gave all this to Britain was an unlikely conqueror, a tormented soul who came from nowhere, driven only by an unwavering ambition. His name was Robert Clive. 1772, the Houses of Parliament in London. Robert Clive is fighting for his survival. He has laid the foundations of the British Empire in India and in the process made himself a vast fortune. Now he stands accused of criminal greed and exploitation. In the House of Commons, he rises to his defense.
Gentlemen, a great prince was dependent on my pleasure. An opulent city lay at my mercy. Its richest bankers bid against each other for my smiles. I walked through vaults which were thrown open to me alone, piled on either hand with gold and jewels. Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation.
Robert Clive will not be bowed. His life is ending as it began, in a furious and lonely struggle. Born in 1725 in Shropshire in the west of England, he was given up by his mother as a child and raised by relatives. It happened at the insistence of his father, an ineffectual lawyer from the minor country gentry, who barely earned enough to keep the family afloat. Rejected by his family and naturally unruly, young Robert was soon running wild in the little town of Market Drayton. He pioneered the business methods which would make him his later fortune as the head of a juvenile gang. It was a protection racket. If merchants agreed to pay a small fee, the boys would agree not to break their windows. Robert was adventurous, brave, and bad. He was an average student and much more interested in mischief than in school. He climbed the church tower of Market Drayton and hung over the side for the sheer thrill of it. Robert grew up craving excitement, but wanted acceptance by his family even more. When he was 17, a job as a clerk in the East India Company promised adventure, money, and a chance to redeem his family. Clive set his sights on India. On the 1st of June, 1744, a cutter deposited Robert in a rowboat just off the coast of Madras. Splashing ashore, he got his first sight of India. The The Madras Robert discovered was an exotic melting pot of Indian, Southeast Asian, and European influences. Here, British, French, and Dutch traders had established themselves to take advantage of the astonishingly lucrative trade in cloth, spices, and opium.
In those days, for young men who became clerks in the East India Company were a little bit like the sort of Eurobond dealers of their day. If you wanted to make a great pile, I mean, there was a great risk attached to this, because you could go out to India and promptly die of some dreadful disease. But there was a chance also, it was 50-50 really, that you might make a whole sort of pile of money.
These early European colonialists merged with the Indian population much more completely than later ones would. Many traders went native and began to behave like local potentates.
So they lived as Indians, wore Indian clothes quite often, certainly adopted Indian manners and customs. Many of them had harems. As far as Indian princes are concerned, they looked upon the company as another Indian presence, not as a foreigner necessarily invading.
This was global capitalism in its infancy. Clive and his friends were pioneers of the system that would soon dominate the entire world. But in 1745, Robert was discovering that the life of a clerk in India was not easy. His salary was £5 a year. He soon felt desperately lonely and more cut adrift from home than ever. His unhappiness came to a head when several ships appeared in the harbor. Every European in Madras received a letter or package from home, except Clive. He was devastated. Clive had a mercurial temperament. This apparent humiliation at the hands of his family plunged him into the depths of depression. Feeling utterly alone and cast off, he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Twice it failed to go off. Fate, it seems, must be reserving me for some other purpose, he would later tell a friend. In fact, fate had extraordinary things in store for Clive. Wild swings of fortune, dizzying heights, but also the darkest depths. Throughout his life, periods of intense, feverish activity would alternate with bouts of deep despair. He would probably be diagnosed today as a manic depressive. Clive soon discovered that opium was the only cure, and he would use it as a medicine for the rest of his life. Clive got used to loneliness.
The British lived in Fort St. George. You had the fort, and then you had Blacktown outside, and they call it Blacktown, and that's where all the Indians lived. The British seldom ventured into Blacktown except when they wanted to go and pick up hookers, basically. And Clive certainly was known that he had a sort of fondness for prostitutes.
Perhaps the one consolation for Clive and his fellow colonialists was that being so far from home, they could do whatever they liked. As a proverb of the time said, there are no sins south of the equator. As Europeans woke up to the phenomenal profits to be made in India, the competition for trade intensified. Finally, in 1746, open war broke out between the British and French in India, each side supported by their local allies and clients. It was just the push Clive needed. He was galvanized by new energy and enthusiasm. For the next 5 years of Anglo-French conflict in India, Clive fought in the militia of the East India Company, where his raw aggression and boundless energy won him promotions and success at the same furious pace. In return for his victories against the French, culminating in the Battle of Arcot, he was rewarded with an appointment as quartermaster of the company factory at Madras. He would find a way to make a profit out of the soldiers' provisions.
Now, it doesn't sound very grand, but the great thing about quartermaster is that you were given a great wad of money and told to go and feed your troops. And if you could feed your troops on half the amount of money that you'd been given, then you were allowed to keep the rest.
By the time Clive was 27, he had made himself a small fortune, £40,000. Clive was also being credited with turning the tide against the French. News of his success astonished the family back in England. His father is said to have remarked,
"Perhaps Robert is not such a booby after all."
Finally, Clive was getting the recognition he craved. Now he hungered for it on a wider stage. One event would set the seal not only on Clive's fortunes in India, but that of the British as well. In 1756, the Mughal Nawab, or Prince of Bengal, Siraj, seized the British East India Company's fort in Calcutta. The British in India were furious. Their outrage soared when stories circulated about the Mughals' treatment of European prisoners. When he seized the fort, Siraj had ordered the imprisonment of all company employees. The Indians locked their British captives in a cell designed by the British for Indian captives. It was tiny, 18 by 14 feet, with only a couple of minuscule barred windows. The night of June 20th, 1756, was suffocatingly hot. When the door opened the next morning, at least 40 British were dead. The Black Hole of Calcutta, they called it, and the incident sparked uproar. It was just what Clive had been waiting for. Here was a chance to really take control of India and make a name for himself. He received command of a small British army. Clive and his troops hit Bengal like a monsoon. In 1757, he swept into Calcutta and forced the Nawab's troops to withdraw. With promises of lucrative deals, Clive then strong-armed an Indian prince into joining him in a military alliance against Siraj. With typical guile, Clive secured the allegiance of his Indian allies with fraudulent treaties. Finally, he marched into Bengal with 800 European troops and over 2,000 Indian sepoys. It was an impressive force, but nothing compared with what Siraj mustered against him. 50,000 well-armed men, backed up by the French and 50 pieces of state-of-the-art heavy artillery. The two armies met near a town called Plassey. The Nawab's superiority may have seemed overwhelming, but Clive knew that discipline, not numbers, was the key.
The Europeans had already gone through something like a bureaucratic military revolution in the organization of their armies. Everyone is trained to act in unison, and it is not heroic battle action which matters, but the discipline of formation and a quick succession to anybody who falls in the field of battle, exactly as one faceless bureaucrat is replaced by another. Clive was outnumbered enormously, but he could use his resources much more effectively.
Faced by the disciplined phalanxes of the British trained troops, the Mughal army fell apart. Clive's triumph at Plassey effectively gave India to the British. Although the British Empire in India would not be formally declared for another 100 years, India now belonged to the British East India Company. Clive became known as the Master of Bengal and lost no time in turning his position into an astonishingly lucrative business. He had learned the technique years ago as a quartermaster in Madras. Indian merchants were prepared to do anything to ensure their continued good relations with the East India Company. On the same principle, the Prince of Bengal now paid Clive huge sums to ensure his favor. On top of this, Clive was collecting trade and land revenues. Within the space of 2 years, he had amassed a huge fortune. But with the action over, it was not long before Clive slumped into another cycle of depression, accompanied now by agonizing pains in his stomach, gout, and prostration. In 1760, he returned to England as Clive of India, a very rich, very famous, and very sick man. When Clive returned to London, one of the only things that could drag him from his gloom was the prospect of a spending spree. He now had wealth, recognition, fame in India. The only thing he didn't have was social position in England. He decided he would buy his way into the English upper classes. He hungrily set out to amass property and social status in equal measure. He remodeled the family home at Styke and bought 4 more. A luxurious townhouse in London's Berkeley Square, 2 more estates in England, and 1 in Ireland, too. He engineered himself a seat in Parliament, and one for his father also. The power and reach of Clive's money was huge, but not limitless.
The one thing Robert Clive wanted more than anything else was to be accepted by the establishment and the aristocracy, and for people to consider him a gentleman. He did flash his money around, and sadly, people considered him to be rather vulgar. They didn't like this chap coming back from India out of nowhere and buying all these estates and big houses, you know, and sort of buying his own furniture, if you like.
Clive soon found himself mired in the intricacies of the English class system. Try as he might, spend as he might, the inner circles of the aristocracy would not let him in. His rough manners only made things worse for him. They called him a Nawab, English slang based on the Hindi word Nawab, or ruler.
The Nawab is a pejorative expression for an Englishman who has developed a bad stomach, a bad digestion, bad temper as a result of overindulgence in India, and usually plundered India and made a lot of money. There's something like robber barons, in fact. And their idea was to make a fortune here and then establish themselves in England as respectable notables and try to make a political career there. Now, in England, they were looked upon as adventurers who were slightly seedy. Now, Clive was a classic example of just that.
The English aristocracy closed its doors in Clive's face. But Clive was not to be put off. Still intent on a social climb, Clive decided to try a different tack. To enhance his reputation, he agreed to return to India in a different role. No longer just the businessman, but now statesman as well. In 1765, only 5 years after leaving, the 40-year-old Clive returned to India as governor of the British East India Company. He now cast himself as a high-minded champion of British interests. Clive's mission was to clean up the practices of the British in India. They certainly needed it. In the 8 years since Clive's victory at Plassey, profiteering had run wild in Bengal. The British had achieved an effective trade monopoly. British merchants and soldiers strong-armed and extorted money from Bengali traders, just as Clive himself had once done. Resentment was seething. Clive countered the growing unrest with a tone of patrician contempt for all the practices that had made him rich.
The confusion we behold, what does it arise from? Rapacity and luxury. The unreasonable desire of many to acquire in an instant what only a few can or ought to possess.
With almost biblical fervor, Clive launched reforms outlawing the abuses he had instituted. In a whirlwind 20 months, Clive totally revamped the British East India Company. By the end of it, he was drained. And it was now that disaster struck. In 1769, the monsoon rains failed in Bengal. And in 1770, famine set in. Hundreds of thousands died, as much as 1/3 of the population. Share prices for the East India Company's stock plummeted. By 1772, the company's credit had failed. Meanwhile, stories were circulating that English merchants were hoarding rice as Indians starved. There was a public outcry against the company. People looked for a scapegoat. Fingers pointed at Clive. It was a bitter irony. Only as Clive was at last making a noble-hearted effort to clear up the morass of greed in India was he finally accused of being its cause. A parliamentary committee was formed to investigate the company and Clive's role in it. The accusation: extortion and profiteering in India. As usual, energized by the prospect of a fight, Clive rose magnificently to his own defense in the House of Commons. And it was now he made his famous speech, saying that given the opportunities for self-enrichment in India, he was astonished at his moderation. Clive was cleared, but there was no joy in it for him. He had been stung by the accusations. He had effectively given India to Britain. Now he was furiously bitter at what he felt was his country's ingratitude. He was once again being rejected. Predictably, he plunged back into depression. His agonizing stomach pains returned, this time complicated by gallstones. Even opium did little to relieve the pain.
I have a disease which makes life insupportable, but which the doctors tell me won't shorten it an hour.
He drifted from one mansion to another, barely unpacking before setting off for the next. Little did he know, many in the British government had, in fact, been deeply impressed with his reforms of the East India Company. They were on the verge of giving him control of yet another colony that was in chaos and on the verge of revolt: North America. Unaware of the honor that was pending, Clive was consumed by humiliation and despair. On the 22nd of November, 1774, as his family prepared to leave the London house at Berkeley Square for Bath, they heard a crash in Clive's room. When they rushed in, they found him dead. Robert Clive, still only 49 years old, had cut his own throat.
Clive's death created a huge scandal. There was a sort of big hush-up and a lot of sort of muted whispering was going on in the corridors of power as to whether he killed himself. It sounds like he slit his throat with a penknife.
Suicide was a sin. In grief and shame, Clive's family removed his body by night and buried him without a headstone in the little church of Morton Say outside Market Drayton, the town where he had run wild as a child. After Clive's death, the British grip on America loosened and tightened on India. The profits to be earned there resumed their flow. 100 years later, the Koh-i-Noor, the fabulous diamond Babur had dismissed as worthless compared to the life of his son, was in the British crown jewels. Krishna's gift had been a test of mankind's greed. What would they do with all that wealth? Would they behave like beasts, or think and achieve wisdom?